The air in the country club ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating perfume of old money. I stood there, my hand tucked into Mark's arm, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, a perfect accessory for a man who valued optics above all else. Then it happened. Mark leaned into the microphone, gave a crooked, arrogant grin to the room full of investors and socialites, and let out the words that changed everything. "I'm clearly marrying her for the money." The room exploded. A wave of condescending elite laughter crashed over me. I saw his father's smug nod and his friends' mocking eyes. They didn't see a woman. They saw a paycheck. Mark squeezed my arm, expecting me to play the part, the quiet, embarrassed bride-to-be who would blush and look away. Instead, I let the silence stretch just long enough to turn the tide. I leaned into the mic, my voice steady and cold as a winter morning. "It's a funny joke, Mark, especially considering the ironclad prenuptial agreement we signed at 9 a.m. today, the one that ensures you don't touch a single cent of my family's legacy, even in death." The silence that followed was deafening. The color drained from Mark's face, and his parents' smiles didn't just fade, they curdled. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a party. It was a declaration of war. If you think this is just another story of a girl being mocked, you're wrong. Stick with me until the very end, because what I did over the next 30 days wasn't just about leaving. It was about a strategic, high-stakes dismantling of a dynasty. You won't believe the secret my mother-in-law was hiding, or the final shocking twist that left Mark with nothing but the echo of his own cruel laughter. My name is Casey, and at 38, I have spent the better part of a decade as a creative strategist, a profession that essentially means I am paid to see the cracks in a facade before the rest of the world does. I grew up in a comfortable, quiet corner of New England, raised by parents who taught me that true power doesn't scream, it whispers, and that a woman's greatest asset is her ability to remain unreadable in a room full of talkers. I had built a life of independence and professional respect, or so I thought until I met Mark and found myself swept into a world where the rules were written in invisible ink and the stakes were measured in social standing. The ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club was a masterpiece of orchestrated elegance, a sea of ivory silk and polished mahogany that felt more like a courtroom than a celebration. The air was heavy with the cloying sweet scent of Casablanca lilies, thousands of dollars worth of blooms that seemed to be gasping for breath under the weight of the humidity and the even heavier expectations of the guest list. As I stood by the gilded podium, I watched the way the light caught the faceted edges of the crystal glasses, creating tiny fractured rainbows on the tablecloths. These were people who understood the choreography of a polite life. They were the partners of prestigious law firms, the owners of generational estates, and the guardians of a very specific American dream. To them, I was a charming addition to the family portfolio, a creative from a respectable background who had finally been ushered into the inner sanctum. I could feel their eyes skimming over me, assessing the drape of my gown and the sparkle of my engagement ring, treating me less like a bride and more like a high-value acquisition that had successfully passed its final inspection. Mark stood beside me, radiating the kind of effortless confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. He looked every bit the scion of the Vanderbilt-esque legacy. He was born into his tuxedo, tailored to a degree of perfection that felt almost aggressive. He reached out and adjusted the microphone, a playful smirk dancing on his lips that I had once mistaken for boyish charm. The room fell into a practiced, expectant silence. Mark didn't start with a tribute to our meeting or a word about our future. Instead, he leaned in with a glint in his eye that I had never seen before, a cold, sharp edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. He looked directly at his father, the formidable patriarch sitting in the front row, and then let out a sharp, bark-like laugh. He told the room that while everyone was congratulating him on his luck, he was the one who had made the smartest investment of his life. Then, with a casual shrug that felt like a physical blow, he delivered the punchline, "I'm clearly marrying her for the money." The silence that followed was brief, a mere heartbeat of shock before it was replaced by a wave of condescending laughter that rippled through the ballroom like a contagion. It wasn't the warm, inclusive laughter of friends sharing a joke. It was the sharp, jagged sound of the elite confirming a suspicion. They laughed because the idea of me, the strategist from a modest upper-middle-class background, bringing anything of financial value to the great Mark Sterling was absurd to them. They were laughing at my expense, endorsing the narrative that I was a gold digger who had finally hit the jackpot. I looked at Mark expecting to see a flicker of regret or a sign that he was kidding, but his eyes were fixed on me with a terrifyingly clinical intensity. It was a power test. He was waiting to see if I would shrink if I would offer a humiliated giggle to smooth over the awkwardness, or if I would submissively accept the lower rung he had just assigned me in our marriage. In that moment, the man I thought I loved vanished, replaced by a stranger who saw our union as a hierarchy and me as the person at the bottom of it. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, a clarity that was as sharp as a diamond. I didn't flush, and I didn't look down at my shoes. Instead, I waited until the laughter reached its peak and began to taper off, and then I stepped forward toward the microphone. I let a serene, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face, the kind of smile I usually reserved for boardroom opponents who thought they had me cornered. I placed a steady hand on the podium, the silk of my sleeve whispering against the wood, and I let my gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of Mark's mother and father. I told the room that Mark always did have a marvelous sense of irony, especially considering the events of the morning. I kept my voice light, almost conversational, as I mentioned that it was quite a coincidence he'd bring up money now, seeing as we had spent our breakfast hours in his lawyer's office signing the most restrictive prenuptial agreement I had ever seen. I paused, letting the words hang in the air like a chilling mist. I added that since I had insisted on a total separation of assets to protect my own family's legacy, the only thing Mark was truly marrying me for was my company and perhaps my patience. The effect was instantaneous and visceral. The laughter didn't just stop. It died a violent death. The smug grins on the faces of the partners evaporated, replaced by a sudden, frantic recalculation. I saw Mark's father straighten in his chair, his eyes narrowing as they shifted from me to his son with a look of sudden piercing scrutiny. The room shifted from a theater of mockery to a chamber of judgment. By mentioning the prenup, I had stripped Mark of his bravado and exposed the reality that he didn't hold the purse strings he was so proudly snapping. I hadn't won the war, not yet, but I had successfully shifted the gravity of the room. Mark's face was a mask of pale fury, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter, but he was trapped by the very etiquette he championed. He couldn't argue without looking even more foolish, and he couldn't take back the joke that had just backfired so spectacularly. As the waitresses began to move again, their footsteps sounding like thunder in the stunned quiet, I realized that the golden cage I had been so eager to enter was finally unlocked. That night, I realized the joke hadn't embarrassed me. It had exposed the entire structure I was standing inside, and I knew exactly which pillar to pull down first. The heavy silence that followed my mention of the prenuptial agreement was more than just a lull in conversation. It was a shift in the atmospheric pressure of my life. As I stood there watching the color slowly drain from Mark's face, I realized that for the duration of our courtship, his family had viewed my profession with a sort of polite, baffling condescension. To the Sterlings, being a creative strategist sounded like a hobby, a soft occupation involving mood boards, color palettes, and making things look pretty for Instagram. They saw me as someone who lived in the ephemeral world of aesthetics, a delicate bird flitting around the edges of their hard-earned reality of real estate and corporate law. They had no idea that my actual job was the surgical reconstruction of reputation. While they dealt in the tangible world of brick and mortar, I operated in the far more volatile world of perception. I had spent my career in windowless war rooms managing the public downfalls of tech giants and fixing scandals that would have buried lesser men. I was the person called when a billionaire's indiscretion threatened a merger, or when a slip of the tongue on a hot mic risked a company's entire market cap. This generational and class divide, this arrogant belief that modern influence was somehow less substantial than old money, was their greatest blind spot, and it was about to become my greatest advantage. As the party resumed its frantic forced pace, my professional instincts kicked in. I stopped being a bride-to-be and started being a crisis manager at the center of a high-stakes case study. I stood with a glass of champagne, my expression a mask of practiced serenity, and began to map out the room as if it were a battlefield. Every guest was a player with a specific utility or risk factor. I watched the gossiping cousins in the corner, their heads bent together like vultures over a fresh kill. They were the primary distributors of information, the social nodes who would carry the story of Mark's blunder to every country club from Greenwich to Palm Beach by sunrise. I looked at the senior partners of his father's firm, men who valued stability and judgment above all else. In their eyes, I saw a new seed of doubt planted. A man who mocks his future wife at his own engagement party is a man who lacks discipline, and in their world, a lack of discipline is a financial liability. I turned my gaze back to Mark, whose ego was visibly bruised, pulsating beneath his tailored suit. He was the unstable asset, a man so desperate to assert dominance that he had accidentally triggered his own liquidation. I realized that in this ecosystem, a single sentence planted in the right ear, a whisper about unreliability or lack of character, could destroy a man's standing more effectively than any multi-million-dollar lawsuit. This wasn't my first time witnessing a man crumble under the weight of his own words. My mind flashed back to a crisis I handled early in my career involving a pharmaceutical mogul who believed he was untouchable. He had sat in a boardroom similar to this one, laughing off a small ethics violation, underestimating the quiet mid-level auditor sitting at the end of the table. He didn't realize that the auditor wasn't just taking notes. She was gathering the stones for his execution. I had been the one to package those notes into a narrative that eventually stripped him of his board seat and his legacy. That experience had taught me that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous because they are the only one truly listening. Mark had spent our entire relationship talking over me, assuming my silence was a sign of agreement, or worse, lack of intellect. He didn't understand that I was a silent hunter, an athlete of the mind who had been playing a game he didn't even know existed. He had handed me the matches and the gasoline at the podium, and now all I had to do was step back and watch the physics of reputation take their course. The Sterlings believed they owned the narrative of this night, but they were still playing by the rules of the 19th century. They thought a public apology or a generous wedding gift would smooth over Mark's lapse in judgment. They didn't account for the fact that I knew how to weaponize the very etiquette they used as a shield. I knew that the best way to handle a fire wasn't always to put it out. Sometimes you let it consume the structure so you can build something entirely new on the ashes. I watched as the whispers began to circulate the story of the prenup joke, mutating with every retelling. To some, Mark was a brute. To others, he was a fool who had been outsmarted by his own bride. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't offer explanations or seek sympathy. I simply moved through the room with a dignity that made his cruelty look even more garish by comparison. I was already drafting the next phase of the campaign in my head, identifying which pillars of his social support were the most brittle. By the next morning, that single joke existed in a dozen different versions across the city, and for the first time in my career, I was going to let the fire burn. The fallout from that morning's legal session was finally beginning to manifest in the shifting glances of the party guests, yet they still only understood the surface of the document I had forced into existence. When Mark and I sat in that mahogany-paneled conference room just hours before the engagement party, his lawyers had focused entirely on the preservation of the Sterling estate, ensuring that not a single family heirloom or share of stock could ever find its way into my hands. Mark had smirked through the entire process, leaning back in his leather chair with the air of a man who had already won. He was so consumed by the protection of his inheritance that he completely overlooked the public morality and image consistency clause I had quietly insisted upon. While he was protecting his bank account, I was protecting my brand and my dignity. This specific clause, a sophisticated piece of legal engineering often used by high-profile executives, stipulated that any public disparagement, humiliation, or behavior that significantly damaged our joint social standing or my professional reputation would trigger an immediate, non-negotiable dissolution of the engagement. The penalties weren't just financial. They included a total forfeiture of any communal claims and a pre-signed public retraction. It was a safeguard designed to punish impulsive arrogance, and Mark, in his hurry to prove he was the one in control, had signed it without a second thought. He saw the behavioral fine print as a mere formality, a quirk of my creative personality, never imagining that he was actually handing me the shears to cut his leash. Watching him now as he attempted to laugh off the tension with a group of his college friends, I realized he had no idea he had already tripped the wire. His crude joke at the podium wasn't just a lapse in taste. It was a documented violation of a legally binding agreement. In the eyes of the law, we had both just acknowledged he had disparaged his partner in a public forum with the intent to diminish her social standing. I found myself observing him with a strange detached curiosity, much like a scientist watching a moth fly toward a flame. Mark had been so blinded by dollar signs and the need to assert dominance over me in front of his peers that he hadn't even bothered to read the definitions section of the document. He believed that money was the only thing that could ever hold him accountable, never realizing that reputation is the currency that actually buys a seat at the table in his world. I wasn't looking for a lucrative settlement or a piece of his family's fortune. I had my own career for that. What I was looking for was a clean, undisputed exit strategy that would leave my name untarnished and his ego in tatters. By violating the morality clause so early and so publicly, he had given me exactly what I needed: a for-cause termination of our relationship that he could never contest in court or in the court of public opinion. The psychology behind my insistence on that mirror clause went far deeper than mere legal protection. I had spent years watching powerful men treat the women in their lives like background scenery, convenient, decorative, and entirely disposable. I had seen wives smile through the gritted teeth of public mockery, accepting jokes about their spending or their intellect as the price of admission to a wealthy life. I refused to be one of them. The clause was meant to be a mirror, a forced confrontation with his own lack of character. If Mark could not maintain the basic decency of a gentleman in a room full of his own peers, then he certainly could not afford the privilege of being my husband in the private sanctum of our home. I wanted a document that reflected his actions back at him with cold, clinical precision. It was never about greed. It was about the validation of my own self-worth. I knew that a man like Mark would only respect what he was forced to respect, and since he didn't respect me as a person, he would have to respect me as a legal entity. The law was simply the tool I chose to ensure that my boundaries were not just heard, but enforced with the weight of a signature. As the night progressed and the champagne continued to flow, Mark seemed to regain some of his bluster, unaware that the document he had dismissed was already working against him. He walked over to me, placing a possessive hand on my lower back, as if the scene at the podium had never happened. I could feel the heat of his palm through the silk of my dress, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a gesture of affection. It felt like a claim of ownership. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollowness behind the expensive smile. He lived in a world where everything could be bought, where every mistake could be buried under a pile of cash, and where sorry was just a word used to pivot to the next transaction. He didn't understand that I had changed the rules of the game. I wasn't playing for his money, and I wasn't playing for his love. I was playing for his realization that I was the one who had been in control from the moment we sat down at that conference table. He had underestimated the creative girl once again assuming my focus on image was a sign of vanity rather than a strategic mastery of social consequences. I felt a sense of profound peace as I leaned into him, offering a practiced smile for the photographer circling the room. I knew that the exit I had planned was now inevitable and perfectly legal. The prenup didn't accuse him of anything. It simply sat in my safe, waiting for the moment his own mouth became his undoing. In the days following the engagement party, the air in the Sterling household underwent a chilling transformation, one that Mark was too arrogant to notice but that I felt in every interaction. The transition was subtle, manifesting in the sharp edges of a cold shoulder that slowly isolated Mark from the very foundation he took for granted. The boisterous dinner invitations that once filled our calendar simply ceased, replaced by a deafening silence from his father's office. When Mark did manage to get his parents on the phone, the conversations were brief, transactional, and devoid of the familiar warmth of familial pride. I watched from the periphery as Mark's father, a man who viewed reputation as a sacred oath, began to look at his son not with affection, but with a growing, palpable disappointment. To a man of his stature, Mark's public mockery wasn't just a slight against me. It was a low-class display of insecurity that signaled he was unreliable. In their social circle, being a brute was a sin, but being a fool who couldn't control his own tongue was a catastrophe. Mark was blind to the fact that his social currency was devaluing by the hour, but I could see the ledger clearly. He thought he was still the golden boy, unaware that the patriarch was already mentally moving him to the liability column of the family estate. The atmosphere reached a breaking point when Mark's mother Eleanor reached out to me requesting a private tea at a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe far from their usual haunts. I expected a confrontation, a lecture on family loyalty, or perhaps a tactical attempt to buy my silence. Instead, I found a woman who seemed to have aged a decade since the party. As she sat across from me, her perfect manicure trembling slightly as she lifted her cup, she didn't offer excuses for her son. Instead, Eleanor began to peel back the polished veneer of her own 40-year marriage, revealing scars I never suspected existed. She spoke in a low, hollow voice about decades of enduring similar jokes from Mark's father, cruel barbs delivered over candlelight public dismissals disguised as humor, and the slow, agonizing erosion of her own identity. She described the gilded cage she had lived in where the price of the pearls around her neck was the constant swallowing of her pride. Then she looked me directly in the eyes with a fierce, heartbreaking clarity and said, "I stayed so you wouldn't have to." This wasn't a mother-in-law defending her cub. This was an unexpected ally, a woman who had seen my reflection in her own past and decided to break the cycle of silence. That afternoon, the tea remained untouched as the conversation shifted from shared pain to a tactical handover of power. Eleanor reached into her handbag and produced a small leather-bound folder, the missing pieces I hadn't even known I was looking for. She didn't just have grievances, she had evidence. She provided me with detailed records of Mark's reckless financial diversions, secret offshore accounts he'd used to hide his personal debts from his father, and proof of indiscretions that would make the public morality clause in our prenup look like a gentle suggestion. This wasn't an act of betrayal against her son. It was a desperate act of salvation for another woman. She knew that if I married Mark, I would become another ghost in the Sterling mansion, a creative spirit crushed under the weight of his inherited narcissism. By giving me this leverage, she was handing me the ammunition to ensure that when I walked away, I wouldn't just be leaving a relationship, I would be dismantling his ability to ever hurt another woman the way his father had hurt her. The balance of power which had felt so precarious on the night of the party shifted completely and irrevocably in my favor. I sat there in the dim light of the cafe, realizing that the narrative had transformed from a simple revenge plot into a profound liberation narrative. I wasn't just a strategist protecting her brand anymore. I was a conduit for a woman's long overdue justice. Eleanor didn't want a scene or a scandal that would ruin the Sterling name. She wanted me to be free, and in doing so, she was finding a small measure of her own freedom through me. She whispered instructions on which bank records to cross-reference and which names in the Sterling organization would be sympathetic to a quiet exit. Her knowledge was surgical, born from years of being the invisible observer in the rooms where the real decisions were made. As the meeting drew to a close, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was no longer alone in this fight. I had the architect of the family herself providing the blueprints for my escape. When she reached across the table, her hand was cold, but her grip was like iron, a physical tether between two generations of women who had finally decided they had had enough. As Eleanor gripped my hand, her eyes weren't those of a mother-in-law, but of a prisoner handing over the keys to the gate. The iron grip of Eleanor's hand remained as a ghost of a sensation on my skin as I returned to the penthouse. We shared a sprawling glass monument to Mark's vanity that now felt like nothing more than a temporary holding cell. I didn't spend the night in tears or packed in a suitcase of regret. Instead, I sat in the glow of my laptop, moving with the clinical precision of the strategist I was born to be. While Mark lay in a deep oblivious sleep in the next room, snoring away the remnants of an expensive scotch, I orchestrated what I call the social blackout. Using my professional network and the templates I had used for a dozen corporate crises, I drafted a perfectly polished, devastatingly polite joint statement announcing the end of our engagement. I hit send at 4 a.m., ensuring it would land in the inboxes of the Sterling Partners, the country club board, and our entire social circle just as they were sipping their morning espressos. I didn't use words like betrayal or mockery. I framed our split as a divergence of values. In the rarefied air of the American elite, that specific phrase is a coded death sentence. It implies a fundamental lack of character, a breach of the unwritten moral code that separates the respected from the merely wealthy. By the time the sun began to peek over the Manhattan skyline, Mark's reputation was already being dismantled by the very people he spent his life trying to impress all while he remained blissfully unaware. When the heavy oak door of the bedroom finally groaned open around 9 a.m., Mark wandered into the kitchen looking for coffee and the subservient woman he thought he owned. He saw my bags by the door and laughed that same arrogant barking sound that had echoed through the country club ballroom. He started to launch into a condescending speech about how dramatic I was being, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single spoken word. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't offer him the emotional theater he was prepared to mock. Instead, I stood by the marble island and simply slid a manila folder across the cool stone toward him. Inside was a formal violation report, drafted by my attorneys, detailing the breach of the mirror clause from the night of the engagement party, supported by a dozen witness statements I had quietly gathered. Beside it was a list of every person who had already received our joint statement. I watched his eyes scan the names, his father's senior partners, the hedge fund managers he was trying to court the donors to his family's foundation. I watched the realization sink into his features like a slow-moving poison. It wasn't just that he had lost a creative girlfriend he could belittle. He had lost his standing in his father's firm and his seat at the table of the people whose respect he craved more than anything. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but the silence I maintained was a wall he couldn't climb. There is a profound power in refusing to argue with someone who no longer matters. Mark looked at the violation report, then at the list of notified parties, and finally at me, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who realized he had finally met someone he couldn't buy or bully. I didn't wait for his excuses or the inevitable explosion of his ego. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy 3-carat diamond ring that had felt like a shackle for the last 6 months, and placed it quietly on top of the legal papers. I didn't throw it. I placed it with the care of someone returning a borrowed item that no longer served a purpose. By executing the mirror clause, I had ensured that my personal and professional assets were legally cordoned off from the Sterling machine. My name was untarnished because I was the one who had controlled the narrative from the first second of the fallout. I had turned his joke into the very evidence that allowed me to walk away with my head high and my dignity intact. The house that had once seemed like a pinnacle of achievement now felt like a tomb, a cold museum of things bought but never earned. As I took one final look at the penthouse, I saw Mark standing there clutching the edge of the island, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He was surrounded by the finest things money could buy, yet he was utterly impoverished in every way that counted. He had believed that his status gave him the right to treat people as props in his personal drama, never imagining that a soft creative like me had the iron in her soul to write a different ending. I picked up my keys and walked toward the door, the sound of my heels on the hardwood floor steady and rhythmic, the sound of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. I had used his own arrogance as the catalyst for my liberation, and in doing so, I had ensured that he would never be able to look at another woman without wondering if she was also taking notes. I felt the cool air of the hallway. As I stepped out, a sense of lightness washing over me that was more intoxicating than any champagne. I was leaving behind the drama, the toxic legacy of the Sterling name, and the man who thought a woman's worth could be measured in a punchline. I didn't leave a mess, and I didn't leave a note. I left a vacuum that his ego would never be able to fill. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that glass and steel penthouse, and the air I breathe today feels profoundly different, clearer, lighter, and entirely my own. I am sitting in my new office, a space defined by warm sunlight and the quiet hum of a firm that bears only my name, watching the skyline of a city that once felt like a predator but now feels like a playground. From time to time, echoes of the sterling world reach me through the filtered grapevine of the industry, and the news is as satisfying as a perfectly executed campaign. Mark didn't bounce back with the easy grace he expected. Instead, he has become a cautionary tale whispered over martinis at the clubs he once frequented. The joke that was meant to diminish me became a permanent shadow that followed him into every boardroom. I heard recently from a mutual acquaintance that his father finally reached his limit, quietly moving Mark out of the family's public-facing business and into a redundant administrative role in an office 3 towns away. In a world where judgment is the primary currency, Mark had proven himself to be a bankrupt asset. He is struggling to regain the trust of the patriarch who now views him as a liability, a man who couldn't be trusted to protect the family's most valuable possession, their reputation. The punishment didn't come from a courtroom or a tabloid. It came from the very people he tried so hard to impress, who now see him as the one thing no one in that circle wants to be: a man who isn't taken seriously. Looking back at the night of the engagement party, I no longer see it as a moment of trauma or a memory to be buried. I see it as a gift, a diagnostic tool of the highest order. That public scenic was the moment the mask slipped, revealing the rot beneath the polished surface, before I had tied my life, my finances, and my future to a lie. It was a test of my internal compass, a challenge to see if I would prioritize the comfort of the room over the survival of my soul. I learned that night that reading the room isn't just about understanding social cues. It's about recognizing when a room is no longer worth being in. There is a specific dangerous pressure placed on women to laugh at their own expense, just to maintain the peace, to offer a graceful smile when they are being dismantled by 1,000 tiny cuts of humor. We are told that being a good sport is a virtue, when in reality it is often just a slow-motion surrender of our own dignity. I realized that the silence I held that night wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the silence of a strategist gathering the data needed to win. I didn't laugh because there was nothing funny about being undervalued, and by refusing to participate in my own humiliation, I forced the room to see the ugliness of the perpetrator rather than the embarrassment of the victim. To the women who are listening to my story, the ones who have spent decades being the quiet strength behind the scenes, the ones who have been told they are too sensitive when they don't appreciate a cruel joke, I want you to know that your dignity is a weapon that never blunts. For so many years, we are taught to be the bridge builders and the peacekeepers, often at the cost of our own self-respect. We are told that our careers are creative or supportive, labels used to diminish the fierce intellectual power we bring to the table. But I am living proof that you can master a social battlefield without ever raising your voice. You don't need to scream to be heard. You just need to be the one who controls the exit. I didn't just survive a bad relationship with a narcissist. I mastered his environment and came out as the commander of my own destiny. The sterling name meant nothing the moment I decided my own name was worth more. We have reached a point in our lives where we no longer need to prove our worth to people who aren't even qualified to assess it. Your life is not a supporting role in someone else's drama, and your happiness is not a commodity to be traded for a seat at a prestigious table. The triumph I feel today isn't about the money or the office. It's about the fact that I can look in the mirror and see a woman who stood her ground when it would have been so much easier to simply sit down. I think of Eleanor often and the leather-bound folder she handed me, a reminder that we are never as alone as we feel, and that our collective strength is the most powerful deterrent to the men who think they can mock us into submission. I have built a new life on the foundation of that truth, and my business is thriving precisely because I refuse to work with anyone who doesn't understand the value of character. The sterling joke was the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to stop being a curated exhibit and start being the architect of my own joy. I am no longer looking for a sanctuary in someone else's house. I have built my own, and the walls are reinforced with the lessons of that ballroom. So the next time the room erupts in laughter at your expense, look closely at who is laughing, because that sound isn't an insult, it's the GPS coordinates for your exit. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that glass and steel penthouse, and the air I breathe today feels clearer and entirely my own. My new firm bears only my name, and the news from the sterling world is as satisfying as a perfectly executed campaign. Mark has become a cautionary tale whispered at clubs. His father eventually moved him to a redundant administrative role in a small town. The joke that was meant to diminish me became a permanent shadow that followed him into every boardroom. This diagnostic tool showed me the rot beneath the polished surface before I tied my life to a lie. I learned that reading the room is about recognizing when a room is no longer worth being in. To the women listening, your dignity is a weapon that never blunts. You don't need to scream to be heard, you just need to control the exit. I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where a joke felt like a slap in the face? Did you stay or find your way out? Share your stories below to inspire our community. If Casey's journey moved you, please subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice. The next time a room laughs at your expense, look closely at who is laughing because that sound is the GPS coordinates for your exit.